So let's shed some light on prop file and config file and why they go where they go. And maybe it'll help clean up some confusion as to why am I putting that there or how do I put it there? Questions people have. This is probably the 17,000th video about how to do something Proffie, but maybe I'll make it really short and easy to digest. Okay. There's an order to things and there's a hierarchy to things. So those are two things I want to talk about. The sequence of how things run and the folder structure, which is really a directory, but we'll just call it folder. Okay, so we'll talk about those things. So the sequence of things, when Proffie OS runs, or when any of this stuff runs, it goes straight down the list here of doing things. It's in sequential order. You sometimes get redirected. I don't know if anybody remembers a Choose Your Own Adventure book, but you can come down and on page 5 it might say, okay, now you have a choice. If you want to, pick up the sword, go to page 32. If you want to leave the sword and just talk to the guy, go to page 20. And from that point in the page, you then jump to somewhere else in the book. You still read the book from cover to cover, but you start going line by line, but then you kind of end up jumping to another point, and then maybe you jump back later. Or like anything else, you're online at the store and there's 5 people in front of you and 2 behind you, and you forgot something. You're like to the guy behind you, can you just hold my spot for a minute? I'm going to be right back. I'm going to run and get some milk, and then I'm going to come back. And they're like, yeah, no problem. So you run, you get your milk, and you come back. You were online, and there's one line, and it goes person, and then the next person goes, and the next person goes. But you were able to like jump out, grab something else, and then come back to the same point in time. Okay? That's like inserting something, and that is what including something in a file means. So, for example, I'm going to pull up proffios.ino, and we're going to go sequentially in the sequence of how things run, okay? At some point in this file, and it's going to be easier just to search, there's a thing called define config prop. Okay, and sequentially we're coming down here and we get to this line. It says define config prop. Well, what does that mean? It's really just taking something out of nowhere. We're making up a thing. It's called config prop, and we're defining that that's now a thing. Okay, so the program says, what are you telling me here? And we say, well, let's make up a thing called config prop. That now exists. Okay, that's defined as being a thing. And the program says, okay. So what? Well, now that you know that config prop is a thing, I want you to now include this config file. It says, okay, well, if you want me to include the stuff that's in a config file, where is this config file? Well, we just so happen to, when you do this right, at the top of the file, you've already defined to the program that config file is equal to your config file that is in your config folder. So we're including your config file. That means go to that file, jump out of line, go check out what's in that file from this point. So we go to the config file and we do this stuff. My point is I'm getting to this here. This is where we add our button control prop file. Okay, which is in the props folder. They live in props, okay? And this will tie into the part 2 where I wanted to talk about the folder structure of how these are in here. But the summary on this moment, we're talking about if defined config prop. Well, 2 seconds ago, remember, we just told the program, hey, define a thing called config prop. So we get now to this point in time and it says, hey, do we have a thing defined called config prop? The answer is yes. So because we do have config prop defined, it will now execute the stuff after that command. If we did not, the way if and end works, if then, if does, if else, all this stuff. If this is not true, then we just skip everything that's in between the if and the end. Okay, this is end if. This is where you start the if. This is where you end the if. Everything in between is only executed if the if is true. So since this is true, and we do have a config prop thing defined, we're going to execute this next command. So we're going to then include this prop file. So again, now from here, we're jumping out and we're going to the prop file. And we're going to gather all the information about how to run the Saber, what the buttons and all the goodies that are in a prop file, the features and how to run the Saber. And then we're coming back to this point, and then we're going to move on. Now, the same way that's an if-def config prop, there's another spot in Proffie OS that says, well, define config presets. Okay, so that when we come back here and it says, hey, do we have a thing defined called config presets? The answer is yes. So we then go forward and we look at the presets and the fonts and all the blade styles and all that stuff. Okay, so that's why it's in if define config prop, is because we did define it. Let me go back to it. We defined that there was a config prop. We then included everything in the config file. So we went to the config and we read it. While we were in here, we read it. This was true. So we also picked up information about how to run the buttons. We get all our presets and all that stuff. Then actually we come back in time. We come back to this same spot. We've now included everything in the config file and subsequently the props file. And then we're back to here. Now it undefines config presets. It defines config. I'm sorry, I was here. It undefines config prop, so it releases it pretty much, like we're done. So if after here we did something, like because we've just undefined it, if the next line is if def config prop, it would be false because we just undefined it here. So that's how the kind of the sequence of it works. That's really it. I just want to explain why this is if def config prop, and then this is why you include your prop file, because you're telling it, hey, go jump out and go find that file, read everything in it, and remember it, because that's how we want to use all the information in there, and then come back to this point because I got more for you. That's what's happening there. As far as the folder structure goes, okay, hierarchy. I think this is lost on current users of computers because we have such powerful search tools. The whole world now just, I don't need to know where it's stored. I can just search for it and come up with it. But, hierarchy matters. The path to a file matters, especially when you're programming. Of course, when you're programming. That's how everything really works. It's based on where you are currently as you're running something, and then everything is relative to where you are, okay? For example, this line starts with 2 dots. And then it says props. Now, why does it say 2 dots? Well, because we are in the config file, right? That's in the config folder. That's here. It's this one. 2 dots in a path in programming, in code, means go back 1 level of directory. So we're here. We need to find this buttons file, which is in a props folder. Well, since we're in here, if we look, there's no props folder in here. No, why not? Because it's back 1 level and then it's down here. So we had to go up a level. That's our dot dot. Then we're going forward into /props. That's here. And then in there, we should find our button file, which we do. So it's relative to where we were at this point. It's saying, well, if you want to go find this, go up 1 level, then go in props instead and get that file. Okay, so that's why this is here with a dot. That's like in your config file, when you define it in Proffie OS INO, in Arduino, okay, this is proffieos.ino. That is this file. Okay, this file is in this folder. This is where we are. Okay, so if we want to find this config file, we need to say the path to that file. You got to go into config first and then go to default, and then go to your config file. So we're here, we look for config, oh, it's here, and then we can find the file. if, and this is totally legit, you could do this. Let's say you had like a bunch of, you had let's say you have a Graflex saber and you want to save, just for example, I'm going to dump like some presets in there, some config files. Let's say these are the configs you like to run on your Graflex folder, on your Graflex saber. That's fine. However, now if you tell Proffie OS INO to find that config file, we've got an additional member to the path. Now you got to go to config Graflex, pretend this was Graflex, my flex.h, right? This is your config file you want. So this path, if I click on it right here, you can see is config Graflex my flex. So this would need to reflect config / Graflex. What I type? My flex, something like this. Oops, I'll do that. See, so now it would find the config file because it's on the path. This is the same thing when we start getting into the presets and fonts. When we're using a common folder or the font search paths, or like tracks are a great example. You have to go down the path to, I'm just looking for a file, give me a second. Yeah, this is just an example, one of my config files, right? So look at this font here. So first we're going to go into a folder, and I'll pull up the actual folder to look at the same time. This is in Saber Fonts, done. So here's how I have my font folder, okay? So if I want this dark V3 as my font name, first I got to go into Darksaber / dark V3. That means in Darksaber, there's a dark V3. This is the path to that file. And then the semicolon delineates between the first place to look, and then common is the next place to look. And then if you want another place to look, if you don't find the files you're looking for in here, like volume menu, let's say, it's maybe it didn't come with dark. No, it didn't. Is it in common? In this case, the answer is going to be no, because in my common folder, I just have all the new edit mode prompts, right? But then I also have a folder called common backup, and that's where like volume up, let's say, was what I wanted. That's where that is. So since it didn't find it here, then it's going to look there, then it's going to look there. But the point is, see, common doesn't have any / because the path to it is right here. Say this was my SD card. That's where it would be on the SD card. If I had a subfolder of common, one last example, I'm going to leave it called untitled folder. And let's say everything in this was actually in here. First of all, I would not leave it with a space in the name because that's not recommended. So I'm going to make it underscore. All right, so now the files for common that I had have to be in untitled folder. So this would need to be common / untitled folder to maintain the path of where it actually is, or else it's not going to know where to find it. Same thing with tracks. People put, tracks. I'm going to undo this before I screw myself up real good. Tracks in a font, let's say in Kylo Ren, right? Tracks are here. If you define this track as just Kylo1.wave, it's not going to find it because it's in a subfolder of tracks. So that's why you have to put tracks / Kylo1. I'm done. That's it. Hope it helps. You can watch again or ask me any questions. Thanks.